This program contains graphic violence and sexual situations. Viewer discretion is advised. A disadvantaged street thug joins New York's powerful Cosa Nostra crime syndicate. Constantly seeking more, he goes against the mob's own code.
He knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get it in the life that he chose, no question about it.
And eventually rises to the upper echelons by killing its leader.
Paul Castellano and Thomas Bilotti were found lying in the street, bullet-riddled, dead as a doornail.
With this new rank comes respect, excess, and the willingness to do whatever it takes, including murder, to stay on top.
Gotti was this person that created havoc in the mob.
This charismatic mob boss thumbs his nose at law enforcement and the FBI, basking in the media limelight.
He was the media godfather of the 20th century.
Until fate brings it all crashing down. Meet John Gotti.
One of the brashest, outrageous, scariest mob bosses of our time.
Just an ambitious gangster until murder made him famous. Throughout the 1980s, John Gotti was a consummate mob star.
Gotti was the first sensational media godfather.
John Gotti became head of the Gambino family, one of 5 Italian families in organized crime. And he got to the top by doing some very bad things.
There's cold-blooded murder. There's betrayal. There are Shakespearean characteristics and operatic characteristics to many of these stories.
John Gotti became almost a folk hero back in the 1980s, basically because he beat the case. He was the first Mafia boss to be acquitted of racketeering charges in 1987.
With Gotti's historic yet suspicious acquittal, the New York tabloids splashed his photo on the front pages of newspapers around the country.
He had a lot of nicknames. He was called the Teflon Don because nothing stuck. And then he was called the Dapper Don, obviously, by the way he dressed. He wore impeccable Brioni suits and hand-painted ties.
He seemed like this invincible figure who walked around and was cheered by his neighbors and lauded by the newspapers.
John Gotti became the subject of Hollywood movies, television shows, and numerous books. His bigger-than-life persona blurred the line between reality and fiction.
People just love to read about the underworld of the Mafia, and it's safe to say that John Gotti loved reading about himself.
He made himself very available, although he didn't speak to the media.
He was so proud of himself that he boasted that he was on the cover of not only New York Times magazine, but of Time magazine, something that no Mafia figure had ever accomplished. And the bottom line was it went to his head and led to his disastrous downfall.
The story of John Gotti begins in the 5 boroughs of New York during the 1940s, where the Italian mob, also called Cosa Nostra, has reigned supreme for over 2 decades.
Cosa Nostra was the word that they used to describe this thing of ours. That is a literal translation. And it was a bond among these men who acted in criminal ways to make money. But they also felt a bond in the way they took an oath, in the way they worked with each other, in the way they related to each other.
While John Gotti is not born into one of the influential mob families, his rough upbringing hones him into a perfect candidate for the Mafia.
He grew up in very insecure circumstances in the tenement district of the Bronx. He often went to school with mismatched shoes, had ragged clothes, nothing matched, and that the other kids made fun of him, tried to bully him.
My understanding is that he never felt his father was doing enough to help out the family or earning enough.
And in this neighborhood, Gotti saw who was respected, who were on it. These men who hung around these so-called social clubs. They seemed to flash money, they had big cars, and they talked about all the women and all the fun they were having. And so he began to emulate them.
Gotti was a fearless, tough guy. There's no question he was a tough guy.
He organized a gang known as the Fulton Rockaway Boys, which was 2 streets in the neighborhood.
He was not afraid to go one-on-one with people with his fists.
He was also involved in all these petty crimes. And by being such a tough street kid, he was spotted by the Mafia members in that neighborhood. And they saw he would carry out orders, showed respect.
The Mafia was a large operation, so John Gotti and his friends were hired for one-off jobs where they learned to lie, cheat, and steal for the mob.
At 14, Gotti attempts to steal a piece of construction equipment, but it leaves him with a permanent disfigurement that would later add to his tough guy persona.
He was involved with trying to steal a portable cement mixer for some organized crime guys.
And for some reason, accidentally dropped it on his left foot and he had to have a toe amputated. Later on, he had this peculiar springy walk, which made him look very tough. But at the time, it was an example of his incompetence.
John Gotti eventually drops out of high school and over the years builds up an impressive criminal record.
He built up what was known as a vast yellow sheet. Yellow sheet in New York was your crime record, your court record. It was mostly petty stuff.
Gotti's track record and his times working odd jobs for gangsters lands him in a favorable position to join the Gambino crime family.
And they were always looking for recruits, people who were young guys who might blossom into Mafia members. And they spotted Gotti.
John Gotti becomes more and more involved with the Gambino family and starts working his way up the ranks. Around the same time, he meets teenager Victoria DiGiorgio.
Hey!
They took a liking to each other. There's no question that it became a romantic interlude for both of them.
You're a bad boy.
Victoria calls him Johnny. He calls her Butch.
I'm told he called her Butch from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And my sense was she loved him. In speaking to her personally, I think she found him a very handsome and attractive man.
Eventually, John and Victoria start a family.
Only unfortunate part was Gotti didn't have enough money to pay the hospital bill.
Come on, gather your stuff. We gotta go.
What for, John?
We gotta go. We gotta get out of here.
What for?
These punks is trying to overcharge us. I ain't paying it.
And Victoria and their newborn baby moved out without paying the bill. But this was just a transparent fact about how hard up he was. He was not successful in his early days as a criminal, and certainly as a wannabe member of the American Mafia.
John and Victoria are married in 1962. During this time, Gotti continues working small jobs for the Gambino crime family, while his own family continues to grow. They have 2 daughters, Angela and Victoria, and 3 sons, John Jr., Frank, and Peter. As a husband and a father, John has big plans for his family's future.
We make good-looking kids, don't we?
Yeah. You know, my pops, he never did nothing. He never earned nothing, and we never had nothing. I don't want that for us. For them.
You gonna do differently?
I'm gonna take care of yous.
We don't need a lot. We just need you, okay?
And you don't want a nice house with white picket fence somewhere in Howard Beach?
Well, I'm not gonna say no.
When I'm through, you'll be a queen. And our kids won't worry for nothing.
John Gotti tries working several legitimate jobs, but old habits die hard.
John Gotti worked as a presser in a coat factory and also as an assistant truck driver, but he soon returned to his life of crime and getting caught.
You're going to jail.
It's nothing. It's like 20 days.
It's not nothing. How are we gonna get food on the table? How the kids gonna eat?
I'll get my job back when I get out.
Jail was not working for a young, growing family. And I think he tried. I think that was probably boring to him.
He decided early on that working for a living was, beneath him, so to speak.
After serving 2 short stints in jail for theft, John Gotti decides the only future he has is working for the Gambino family, and he becomes a full-fledged criminal.
I think the lure of the drama and the camaraderie with friends, and I guess fast money was very attractive to him, and that started him on his life of crime.
He met a couple of tough guys, relatives of gangsters who he hung around with.
So you guys got jobs to make it legit, but don't do those jobs?
It's like magic. You show them your left hand, keep them focused on your left hand, so your right hand can do the work.
John Gotti begins working full-time as what's called a soldier in the Gambino crime family.
I guess fast money was very attractive to him.
With more money coming in, John Gotti moves the family to Howard Beach, a middle-class neighborhood in Queens, New York, where the community is mostly Italian.
He lived in a very modest house. People would always be surprised that he didn't live in something bigger, didn't have a mansion. There were many other people in organized crime that lived in that neighborhood. They were all friendly.
The neighborhood has a strategic importance to the mob as well.
It's very, very close to JFK. Kennedy Airport became an easy mark, a place for them to score goods, hijacking trailers, stuff from warehouses.
Although security at the airport is tight, the mob has a clever way to avoid police detection.
John Gotti and some of his cohorts had friends who worked in Kennedy Airport, and he would find out about loads of goods that were there, ripe to be taken.
Appreciate you, Georgie.
All goes well until 1968, when FBI agents organize a stakeout to catch the thieves.
Looking for anything in particular?
Gotti was spotted hijacking a load of expensive women's dresses, and they were grabbed and nabbed.
Gotti confesses to 3 cargo heists and 2 hijackings after being caught by the FBI.
Gotti pleaded guilty and was sent to federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which was the place that several other crime bosses had served their time.
Gotti's short time in prison allows him the opportunity to rub shoulders with high-ranking Mafia members.
You've had some luck, kid, but watch yourself. These cases got good guys doing dumb things.
I ain't no rat, Mr. Galante.
Good. No friend of ours ever should be.
In 1972, Gotti is paroled. As a free man, he spends most of his time with other mobsters. But rumors soon circulate to his wife, Victoria, about his possible infidelity.
Often, the kids later remembered how about them fighting and shouting at each other.
It was nothing, Vicky. She's just a friend.
You cheating bastard. You're leaving me to do this alone while you're out fraternizing with loose women!
And there was one exceptional incident in which Vicky took a fork and stabbed him in the shoulder.
She's not. Why?
You do not treat me this way, John Gotti!
There's no question that Victoria was sharp enough to understand and realize that her husband, had gravitated into organized crime.
She lived in an environment where people knew who were wannabes or made men, members of the Mafia, sworn inducted members, and she knew what his aspirations were.
In the early 1970s, Gotti meets Neil Della Croce, who is the second in command of the entire Gambino crime family.
When Della Croce came to visit, Gotti showed him eminent respect, and Della Croce took a liking to Gotti and started talking and mentoring him.
Della Croce took him under his wing and put him in a crew that he felt was going to earn money. And they were big earners, the Bergen Hunt and Fish crew.
Della Croce also appoints Gotti to the esteemed position of capo, or captain of the crew.
Now, Gotti at that time was not a made man or inducted. hadn't gone through a formal blood oath.
One way to become a made man is to carry out a hit, to follow orders and kill someone.
Luckily for Gotti, the Gambino family has an important job for him.
Listen, I need you to do us a favor.
Anything.
Carlo Gambino's nephew, Emmanuel, was kidnapped by a gang who were kidnapping gangsters for ransom.
And there's a request for a ransom of $100,000, which Carlo antes up and pays it. And his reward was that his nephew is murdered. Now, that's not the way to ingratiate yourself with a powerful mafia figure.
So there had to be revenge.
Carlo Gambino, the head of the Gambino family, orders the hit.
And Gotti and other crew members were assigned to exact that revenge.
You tell your boys, as acting captain of the Fatico crew, you make sure this happens. Can you do that for me?
No problem.
Before a man can be made, it's good to participate in something like this, John. This is good for you.
Gotti and his crew learn that Jimmy McBratney, an Irish mobster, is allegedly one of the kidnappers.
And they went into a bar, Snoopy's Bar on Staten Island, to find Mr. McBratney. And they, I think, posed as police.
Be cool till we get him outside. James McBratney?
Not if you're the IRS.
No. Police.
He was suspicious, didn't want to go with them. Push came to shove.
Hey, look, I got a family, I didn't hurt no one!
The third man on this job shoots and kills McBratney when he resists.
Jesus, what are you doing?
You know, unfortunate problem for Gotti was that people got a good look at their faces, and Gotti has to hide out for a year until things he thinks might cool down.
Police, however, find Gotti, and on June 3, 1974, he's arrested for the McBratney murder. A plea bargain leads to a 4-year sentence for attempted manslaughter at a state prison about 80 miles from his home in Queens.
With John Gotti in jail, it was up to his wife Victoria to keep the family together. So she would get all the kids together and visit him behind bars.
You look good, babe. Let me talk to my kid.
Victoria was there for her children, and I think ultimately she wanted to be there to protect them and give them a good life, and she was going to stick it out with her husband, but she needed to do what was right for her kids, whether their father was there or not. And if you talk to John Gotti Jr., he will say it was tough not having his father around. You know, how do you explain it in school? What kids would say to him, oh, your father's not around. I think the excuse would be he's on a construction job. So I'm sure she was aware it had to be tough on the kids to handle that.
In 1977, after almost 2 years in prison, John Gotti is released.
Did you miss me?
Hey, Dad. Want to play catch?
Hey, kiddo, just a minute. Your mom and I are catching up.
In recognition of his part in the McBratney murder, the Gambino crime family is ready to welcome Gotti as a full-fledged member.
They needed trusted members and people who are going to follow orders, carry out duties, and be capable of committing crimes and be capable of making money. And so it was time for him to be made.
Do you know why you're here?
No.
Do you know these men?
Yes, I do.
We are the honored society of Cosa Nostra, and you are about to be inducted as a member of our family. Are you loyal?
Yes.
Will you obey the rules of Cosa Nostra and put its interest above your interests, even those of your wife and children?
Yes.
Do you promise never to cooperate with any authority but your Cosa Nostra superiors?
Yes.
They will draw blood, and as they're drawing blood, they cut you, And as you're spilling blood, you are swearing the oath of loyalty. And omerta, which means you should never be talking about this, never talking about the existence of organized crime.
If you ever divulge any secrets of our society, your soul will burn like this saint. You are now a member of our family.
Feared and respected, John Gotti has risen to the top levels of the Gambino family as a made man. And by the late 1970s, Gotti leads his own group of soldiers in Queens, New York.
Things look smooth for Gotti after being made capo, and no question about his importance and elevation in the Gambino family.
In 1978, Gotti is involved in the historic Lufthansa heist, made famous in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas. Mobster turned informant Henry Hill alleges that in 1979, Gotti is the trigger man who kills Tommy DeSimone, the mobster played by Joe Pesci in the film.
But a traumatic event occurs in 1980.
In March of 1980, John Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank is out riding a mini bike, just as John Favara is driving home from work.
John Favara was a backyard neighbor of John Gotti's. He was driving down the street. Frank Gotti drove out into the middle of the street on a borrowed mini bike.
And Mr. Favara hits him and kills him.
John Favara says it was an accident and he did not see Frank in the street until it was too late.
It was a neighbor who called Victoria Gotti to say, your son was just hit by a car.
Oh my God.
And that's when she ran out of the house.
Frankie, baby! Help me, Frankie, baby!
It was a tragic event for the Gotti crime family.
Allegedly, the stages of grief over Frank Gotti's death quickly turn from sadness to revenge.
Because of the death of the boy, Vicky cracks up and blames John Favara, even though the family knew each other. They lived close by.
You need to make this right, John. You need to make this right. You owe me this.
Shortly after, John Favara begins to receive threats from an unknown source.
He initially felt that there was no problem. He had been told, don't worry, they realize that it's a tragic accident and nothing had happened. But eventually, he began to become concerned that there was going to be payback.
Vicky cracked up. When she saw Favara, she took a bat to try to slug him over the head.
You go to hell! You go to hell! Kill my Frankie!
And Favara got very alarmed. I mean, there was no question in that Howard Beach neighborhood who John Gotti was.
And eventually, John Favara decided it was time to move.
But Favara won't get away in time. In July of 1980, 4 months after Frank Gotti's death, 51-year-old John Favara is leaving his furniture business on Long Island when he is confronted and accosted.
Please don't! I didn't mean to do it! I'm sorry! No, please, no!
And several witnesses saw that several men jumped on him, clubbed him over the head, and dragged his body into the rear of a van and drove off.
Taking him! I'm calling the police!
The consensus was that he was murdered and his body was destroyed.
And his body was disposed of. Some people say in a dump, some people say out at sea, but whatever, he was never found.
When John Favara disappears, John and Victoria Gotti have an airtight alibi.
John Gotti and Victoria at the time were in Florida.
Now, whether John knew that something was going to happen or it was a mystery to him is doubtful, because he picked the right time to go to Florida. He was questioned, and so was Vicky when they came back a month later after Favara was gone.
We're investigating the disappearance of Mr. John Favara. Would you happen to know anything about this?
I don't know what happened to him, but I wouldn't be sorry if anything did.
Do you know where your husband is? And you know what he does for a living?
I don't know where he is, and I don't know what he does. I am an old-fashioned woman. All I know is he provides.
Thank you for your time, Mrs. Gotti.
And no one was ever prosecuted for the death of John Favara.
Even after the death of Favara, Victoria Gotti sinks into a deep depression over the loss of her son.
Vicky later admitted that after this death of Frankie, she had 3 attempts to commit suicide.
She was broken up and perhaps even had a breakdown as a result. There were attempts that she made on her life. She was inconsolable. She was depressed. They had her taking medication to help her out and help her recover.
John Gotti's family troubles aren't just limited to his home. Divisions in the Gambino crime family have begun to form after the death of mob boss Carlo Gambino a few years earlier. Second in command, Neil Della Croce, is passed over as next in line in favor of Paul Castellano, Carlo Gambino's first cousin. This doesn't sit well with many in the family, including John Gotti, whose allegiance still lies with Della Croce, the man who has served as his mentor for years.
John Gotti had a beef with Paul Castellano and the way he was doing his business and the way he was ignoring Della Croce.
On top of this, John Gotti and his crew begin dealing in the lucrative drug business by selling heroin.
The American Mafia made a deal with the Sicilian Mafia for importing into America's inner cities heroin for the first time on a large scale. And it was their worst sin that they had gotten now involved in narcotics trafficking.
But they had always felt that narcotics was necessary because of the amounts of money they can make. You could make so much more in that than you could make in gambling, than you could make in loan sharking, even from legitimate industries.
This was strictly forbidden by Castellano, who felt the drug trade was too much of a risk.
When you started peddling drugs, you were not only unreliable yourself if you started partaking, but you were now opening yourself to other law enforcement activity, and that's a tension they didn't want.
Though mobsters break federal and state laws almost daily, they must obey Mafia rules. Many people believe Gotti violated them by dealing in heroin.
It's also rumored that John Gotti broke one other cardinal rule of the mob.
And one Mafia rule is you never mess around with the wife or daughter or any girlfriend of a made Mafia member.
Ernesto's gone till Monday.
He violated that rule. He had a long love affair with the daughter of his mentor, Neil Della Croce. Everybody in the family, in the Gambino family, knew about it. And that she was married to a made member of the family. And yet they carried on.
The alleged affair continues for years, even after Sandy's father, Neil Della Croce, dies at age 71 in 1985.
When Neil died, all bets were off.
With his strongest ally now gone, Gotti fears Paul Castellano wants to make an example of him by having him killed for breaking the family's rules.
Paul Castellano decided to make Tommy Bellotti, his key aide, his underboss. And he also sent out word that the Gotti crew was going to be dispersed and some of the guys were going to be put with different crew members. And this also led Gotti to believe that some of his men might also be whacked.
Gotti realizes that he has no further protector in the family, and he needs to get at Castellano before Castellano puts out a hit contract on him and his pals.
So it was a kill or be killed situation in John Gotti's mind. This gave John Gotti the wherewithal and the reason he needed to go out and kill Paul Castellano. And it came to a head in December of 1985, a couple of weeks after Neil Della Croce passed away.
Gotti went out and got other people he found out might have been repelled by Castellano and wanted to defect.
So he got together with 9 or 10 other gangsters to go out and kill Paul Castellano.
We ain't allowed no misses. We miss, it's the bottom of the ocean we mean next.
And it was a well-planned, well-orchestrated hit.
One of Castellano's men tips off Gotti that Castellano is due to appear at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan called Sparks Steakhouse.
4 men lay in wait outside Sparks Steakhouse.
They were dressed in trench coats and hats, all similar, so that if you were investigating or if there was security video at the time, who was whom?
John Gotti and Sammy Gravano were parked at the corner, maybe a couple of 100 feet away, watching the scene, waiting for Paul Castellano to come to Sparks and park in front of the restaurant.
It's finished.
And Tommy Bilotti and Paul Castellano lay dead. Paul Castellano on the sidewalk, Tommy Bilotti out in the middle of the street.
The FBI agents will tell you all their pagers went off, and the press will tell you all their pagers went off.
Everybody was trying to figure out exactly what had happened, and within a very short time, everybody knew that it was Gotti who was responsible for it.
It was the crowning achievement of John Gotti's Mafia career.
By orchestrating the death of Paul Castellano, John Gotti has positioned himself as the new boss of the Gambino family.
He overnight becomes the boss and the godfather of one of the biggest and most important crime families in America.
John Gotti has gone from poor boy in the Bronx to the stylish king of New York, and for the next few years, he rules one of the most powerful American mafia families. The FBI estimates that during Gotti's reign, numerous murders are committed on his orders. 3 of the victims are Gambino crime family members who allegedly cross either Gotti or his associate, Sammy the Bull Gravano. The Gambino family nets an estimated income of $500 million during Gotti's reign. His personal take is an estimated $12 million per year.
So he's immensely wealthy. He's getting millions every year.
With this extravagant wealth comes a new wardrobe for the man who once wore mismatched shoes as a child.
He would wear these expensive Italian suits, he was clean-shaven, and he was always immaculately groomed.
He was called the Dapper Don, obviously, by the way he dressed.
Silk tailored suits, camel hair coats, hand-painted ties. Every day he went to a regiment of having his hair styled.
He liked looking good, and he knew he was good looking.
Gotti's wealth also helps him feed his gambling addiction.
He was a degenerate gambler who used to scream at God because he had lost a series of races.
He would do things like on one weekend, betting on football games, he lost $90,000.
I was told if 2 cockroaches ran up the wall, he would take the bet.
And this is the way he operated.
As the new boss, Gotti makes several radical changes that will ultimately lead to his downfall. First, he appoints Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's closest co-conspirator in the Castellano murder, as the new underboss of the family. He also demands his capos or captains meet with him weekly at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club.
In the end, his insistence that his gangsters pay homage to him and come to him on Mulberry Street was his undoing.
This draws the attention of law enforcement, who are actively working to build a case against the Dapper Don.
Everybody's eager to try and do something about getting Gotti. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club is now overwhelmed by law enforcement bugs.
The so-called secret society became open news to the federal government. The FBI had a camera stationed across the street, videotaping everybody.
We started intercepting the conversations of Gotti and his criminal organization.
The state of New York and the U.S. Justice Department try to convict Gotti of racketeering and assault in multiple trials, but he is acquitted 3 times.
Do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Earning Gotti the title the Teflon Don.
He was acquitted in these cases, and we later learned it was because of jury tampering.
In one case, a juror sells his vote for $60,000.
He was acquitted because he had paid $60,000 to a juror, and it basically assured him of a hung jury, but as it turned out, he got a total acquittal.
Gotti continuously thumbs his nose at law enforcement by claiming to be a simple businessman with a plumbing company. He offers coffee to FBI agents and reporters who are following him, and he stops to pose for photos.
He would tell his guys to step out of the picture so that the camera would get only him. He loved it. I mean, Gotti was the Dapper Don, no question about it. He was a swashbuckling, arrogant, in-your-face kind of guy who dared the government to come out and get him.
What law enforcement really needed was John Gotti talking about the murders that he had directed, most specifically the Castellano murder. They also needed him to admit that he was the head of the Gambino family.
Investigators hit the jackpot when Gotti is secretly recorded by the FBI talking about his involvement in the Cosa Nostra, another name for the Italian mob.
This is going to be a Cosa Nostra till I die. Be it an hour from now, be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail, it's going to be a Cosa Nostra.
And they get damaging information. They talk about murders, about profits, all sorts of incriminating information that they've been searching for years to get. And now, out of Gotti's mouth, they've got it.
Gotti is also recorded discussing his order to murder gangster Louis De Bono.
He was extraordinarily bad at avoiding both physical surveillance and electronic surveillance.
On December 11th, 1990, FBI agents and New York detectives arrest John Gotti, his underboss Sammy Gravano, and others. They charge Gotti with 5 murders. They include the killings of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti in 1985, Robert D. Bernardo in 1986, Liborio Milito in 1988, and Louis De Bono in 1990. The Teflon Don, however, isn't concerned and even brags that he'll avoid a conviction again.
The prosecutors had learned their lesson. To prevent jury tampering, they kept the jurors anonymous and sequestered. And they also got the judge to declare Gotti's lawyers as in-house counsel, which prevented them from defending Gotti.
It became an international trial. There were reporters from all over the world. You know, Gotti had become such a significant figure. He was a celebrity.
Then a surprise witness shocks everyone. Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's second-in-command, agrees to turn state's evidence. Gravano shares everything about the Castellano murder.
Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, this guy who was supposed to be his top man, his top gun, his main guy, turned out to be the main witness.
He gave play-by-plays of everything from the murder of Paul Castellano to how they conducted business, to who was giving orders to murder whom and why they were doing it. Gravano's testimony was precise. It was compelling. It was fascinating. People that were in the audience were spellbound and very credible.
The testimony by Gravano and the tapes that we had and the tapes that the federal government had certainly were overwhelming.
On April 2nd, 1992, after a federal trial that lasts for weeks and includes 13 to 14 hours of deliberation, a jury finds John Gotti guilty of all charges.
It was sort of mind-numbing and mind-boggling that it was as fast as it was. And I actually interviewed a juror after the trial who told me that Gravano's testimony was good, but it was the tapes of John Gotti himself that led to the conviction.
The Cosa Nostra, the Mafia, the mob bosses, they learned a very, very important lesson from John Gotti. Don't run the crime family on Broadway. Don't be out there in the middle of the street thumbing your finger in the government's eyes saying, I dare you to come and get me, because they will come and get you.
In June of 1992, a judge sentences Gotti to life in prison with no chance of parole.
You know, the curtain came down on John Gotti, and I'm sure he was as shocked as everybody else.
Hundreds of people protest outside the federal courthouse in Brooklyn.
There was a mini riot outside the federal courthouse. They overturned cars. They screamed prejudice and epithets at the FBI and the federal government for railroading John Gotti. There were a lot of people in Italian-American neighborhoods who viewed him as a persecuted figure.
John Gotti liked to think he did well for the neighborhood and the neighbors.
And he gave money to churches, the way he gave money to hospitals. That was part of his attitude or atmosphere, that he was a great benevolent Robin Hood. So Gotti profited from this, and he had these people who were really mistaken in their concept of what he really was. A cold, stone killer, not a humanitarian.
John Gotti went to prison in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security penitentiary.
And he was in a wing where he was locked up usually almost every day for 22 to 23 hours. It was the hardest type of imprisonment that the government could figure out for him.
In 1998, Gotti undergoes surgery for throat cancer at a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri.
He did smoke a lot, he smoked cigars, and he had throat cancer, and it spread.
In 2002, John Gotti dies at the age of 61.
Well, John Gotti's funeral, there were flower cars as far as the eye could see.
The motorcade was comprised of more than 70 limos, and it wound its way through Queens past all of Gotti's favorite hangouts.
And it was one of the longest funeral processions I've ever seen. And I don't know that we'll see anything quite like that again.
Gotti's wife, Victoria, and their 4 kids continue to claim Gotti was a wonderful husband and father and didn't deserve the punishment he received.
She would never talk about the criminal aspect of his life. It wasn't up to her to do that, and I don't think she felt she needed to, or she should. But she would sing her family praises.
Gotti's body is entombed in a crypt next to young Frank, Gotti's 12-year-old son, who died in a tragic accident in 1980. The crypt sits on the 3rd floor of St. John's Cloister, not far from Carlo Gambino's grave in the same cemetery. To this day, people continue to be enthralled by the legacy of the media godfather through movies, television, and books. A reality TV series, Growing Up Gotti, runs on a cable network for 3 seasons, starring daughter Victoria and her 3 sons.
Daughter Victoria Gotti released a memoir called This Family of Mine. And then son John Gotti Jr. released another book called Shadow of My Father, which talked about his infamous dad.
The latest actor to play Gotti is John Travolta in the movie Gotti. John Gotti Jr. is a key advisor on the film.
If Hollywood makes any more movies, the one sin we hope it doesn't commit is that it humanizes and forgets about his evil deeds and tries to glamorize him. And that would be a cardinal mistake.